Every masterpiece begins with one small brushstroke, just like every transformation begins with one small choice. Today, for you dog lovers, I hope to inspire you and to encourage you to choose dog art and creativity instead of toxic habits and thought patterns. Those vices that have not been serving you. Maybe it's stress eating, or binge drinking, or smoking, or worrying. If you're ready to trade those toxic patterns for something colorful, lighthearted, hope-filled, and meaningful, today you're in for a treat. Together, we'll be painting this fun, simple, beginner-level, art therapy-based dog tutorial. And it's my hope that you'll not just walk away with a beautiful dog portrait and a stronger grasp on dog painting technique, but also you'll be empowered to use creativity, even animal art, as a tool, not an escape, for building confidence, for reconnecting with nature, and for replacing those toxic habits and thought patterns. So if you're all new to acrylics, or you're a little rusty and you want to dive back in, everything you need to paint along even today is in a link in the description down below. Let's begin. All right, now I do this outside of my job as an art therapy practitioner. So if you already haven't, be sure to like, subscribe, share with another dog lover that you think this would bless. I've added white, fluorescent pink, and cadmium yellow to my paint palette. I'm gonna mix up a very muted peach color, so lots of white, fluorescent pink, and cad yellow. Again, that's lots of white and then equal parts fluorescent pink and cad yellow. My favorite paint, and it's actually very affordable, is Acrylics by Master's Touch. That's the main one. I also use Liquid-X, like these fluorescent colors. And then the only white I buy is the Fluid Titanium White by Golden brand. All these supplies that I'm mentioning are linked in the description. So if you're using a sided canvas, you want to make sure you have enough mixed up. I'm just going to add a little bit more, same amount of each, just a little bit of fluorescent pink and cad yellow. All right, and the other reason we want to have enough is in case we have to do some touch-ups and fix-ups later after we've painted the dog. But because we want to layer back to front, we want to mix up our background first. I'm going to grab my large size 10 Arteza flat brush, and any time throughout this process I'm going to make sure it's clean and damp, which means the brush has been dipped into the water, I've patted it, not dry and not left it sopping wet, it still has moisture on the brush. And I want to try and keep it that way throughout the process. So I want to get, with our background color, I want to get as close to that sketch as possible. Even better if we get over it a little bit, honestly, because we don't want to have to paint in little white specks later. Now I say that, but then I forget that little small gap between the ear and the chest. So while we're using this color, don't forget that little gap. Now, speaking of gaps, something that can put a big gap in our creativity and our joy is scrolling and being distracted by our phones. So if you can, turn off your phone, use a laptop, or use a TV screen to watch this tutorial. Even better, turn off the notifications on your phone if you already haven't. Also, we can strengthen our focus and our creativity right now as we paint. Notice how I'm holding my brush? I'm not holding it this way because it tends to kind of pull off the paint. I'm gliding it sideways like this, almost horizontal, very lightly, so that I can glide that paint over the canvas, make a nice even layer. Now, I like to call this stage of the creative process the warm-up. We're warming up our hands, we're coming into the present, we're telling our imagination to wake up. And as we do this, I want to encourage you right now to take 4 deep breaths. A deep inhale through the nose and a long exhale out through the mouth. You ready? Let's repeat that 3 more times. So next I'm going to add black to my paint palette so we can work on the eyes, nose, and mouth. Now I'm going to grab my palette knife if you have one. Otherwise you can just use your brush, and I'm going to mix up a dark gray, very dark gray, lots of black, and a little bit of white. Again, that's a good amount of black, a little bit of white. We're going to be using this dark gray for quite a while. Now feel free to use whatever brushes you're more comfortable with. I find the Arteza brushes are excellent for painting dogs. I'm going to use my size 0 round brush. Painting all animals for that matter. I've been using mine since 2021. All right, so we're just going to use a clean, damp, size 0 Arteza round brush, and we're going to carefully outline the eyes with our dark gray and fill in the pupils. Now you notice there is a really strong shadow on this upper eyelid, and so I'm going to make that a bit thicker. You're almost always going to have a shadow that comes down from the upper eyelid. Might not be this bold, but oftentimes when I'm outlining the eye, I'll either bring down this outline so it's a bit thicker, or I'll make sure I add a bit of gray to the iris. That's the colored part of the eye, or both. With a more relaxed, calm dog, or maybe a puppy face where they look a little sad, you're going to have a thicker shadow up here. Now, if the dog is angry or on alert, shocked, you're probably not going to have as much of a shadow there. Those eyes will be open wider, that pupil will be more dilated. We can also see that when the dog is very excited. So as you can see, I'm now filling in that oval-shaped pupil. It just almost touches that upper eyelid shadow. Now acrylics is very forgiving. Let's say you maybe made the pupil a misshapen oval. That's okay, let it dry. And then when we apply our browns for the iris, you can paint over that and just slim out or reshape that pupil. Now, if you'd like to learn more about expressing a dog's unique personality through the eyes, that's an upcoming tutorial I'm working on also, so stay tuned for that. Now continue working, but I'm going to add our colors for the iris, which is raw sienna and orange. Again, that's raw sienna and orange. Now I just want to make a quick note here. We're going to be using the next colors for quite a while for the eyes. So definitely mix up enough so we can go back to them. And not only that, we'll use them to mix up other colors. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull some of my raw sienna into a pile along with some orange and a smidge of our dark gray that we just mixed up to mix up this brownish orange. That's definitely a darker value. So we should get a kind of a muddy looking color like that. That's what we're going to use to start working from the bottom eyelid, that darker shadow above the pupil, over top the iris, okay? The colored part of the eye, right above that pupil. And this is going to be dark, but not darker than the outline that we just added. So I'm filling in the white and then carefully gliding my brush around that pupil and beneath that outline. And there is the slightest bit of gray here and the bit of gray here, so I'm not going to go over those areas. And I won't go all the way down because we'll start pulling in our lighter orange brown. I'm going to wash off my brush. Make sure it's clean and damp just so I can mix up the next color and blend it into that. Now in a separate pile, I'm adding orange and raw sienna. I'm only mixing up a small amount, and I'm going to use the blending technique to both blend into some of that brown at the bottom and pull in more to fill in that orange brown below the pupil now. So over a bit of the bottom of that brown where we left off, I'm using kind of dabs and a circular motion to blend that, and then pulling in more of that orange and raw sienna mixture so it's a bit lighter underneath that pupil. We'll fill that in and join it to the other right side. So I'm going to go all the way down above the bottom eye outline. The bottom eye outline, I'm going to work above that. Now, I'm not going to tell you every time to wash off your brush, but an indication that it's time to is when your brush starts to pull on your canvas or get sticky and it's hard to control your brush. That's a good sign. You want to wash off your brush so it's clean, not sopping wet, not dry, but still moist so you have more control over your paint. I'll remind you in this tutorial to not load up your brush. You don't want to add all the paint to your brush. Just add a little bit, a small amount, especially when doing this detail work, to the tip of your brush. Now before that completely dries, I'm going to go back in. I'm actually going to pull some of this dark brown just so I can get it almost equivalent, but not as dark, but pretty close to it, our gray outline. So I pulled some of our brown with some of the gray, and I really want to make this darker above the eye, but not bringing that all the way down. I am blending that into some of the browns that we already laid down. So I do these tiny little circular movements and dabs. I left a little bit more space here just so we can see where that gray is, and then we can close it back up with the dark gray. Because it's so small, I just want to make sure you can see it if you were wondering. And then with that same color that we just mixed up in a separate pile, I'm going to darken up the side of this eye while it's wet, blending that into the browns and the oranges, and I will bring that all the way down and curving that. So I want it to just curve all the way down right above that dark outline. So if you need to mix up some more, that's what I'm going to do. Mixing up more of the gray mixed with our brown. So just a refresher, that was our gray mixed with raw sienna and orange. Then in a separate pile here, I just mixed in more gray. So that's what we're using now to the right of the pupil. all the way down on the other side. And I don't really want to leave a sharp extreme line there, not like this side. I want this to be more blended. So I'm going to pull in into this brown here, more raw sienna and more orange. And it's got some of that dark gray in it now, a little bit more dark gray in it now. And that's what's going to darken up like this nice blend on the right side of the eye. And I am bringing it down a little further, leaving the slightest bit of highlight. It's not too loud, but it's slightest bit of highlight on the right, bottom right of this eye. If you painted over that by accident, no worries. You can just add in more of your orange with raw sienna. Just a subtle little highlight there. Okay, so moving on to the sclera, which is the gray part that we're painting. I'm gonna, in a separate pile with a clean brush, I have a tiny little bit of white and a tiny bit of black. I wanna make sure that's a medium gray. So it's either gonna be dark, medium, or light. So we've gotten our dark grays, our dark browns. This orange here, I would say, consider that more of a medium value. Now a light value would be if we added lots more white. This background's like a light value. There's such a range of dark, medium, and lights, but try as we're going along to classify it as either a dark, a medium, or light. So this is more of a medium gray. It's not super light and it's not a dark gray. That's what I'm shooting for, to get this gray area right here. And I'm gonna dive right into the dark gray to close that gap. Because I just, like I said before, I didn't bring it all the way down. I just wanted to make sure you guys could see it. But there I closed the gap. I might even have to bring it up a little higher from the bottom too. All right, I'm going to darken that gray, so we do create a dark gray, but it's still lighter than the outline of dark gray. I think I'll even bring it out to a bit more of a point, so it's a bit closer to this line right here. See how I did that? I just brought that point out a bit further, closer to that traceable line. Now, while we have our gray mixed up, we can add the subtle highlight over top the bottom of the pupil. Let's test it out. It might actually still be it's not. I thought it would be too dark, but because I lightened it by adding more white, it's great. And this is our first layer. And what I'm doing is just like stacking lines and dabs at the bottom of the pupil with this medium gray. Not over top the colored part of the eye, but over top the pupil. And then I'll add a bit more white to that and get that a little bit lighter on my paint palette, and then also blend that a little bit lighter closer to the center of the pupil. There's even a small little dot at the top here. See that? It's like a little more triangular shape to the bottom and then a dot. Now looking at the eyes and the nose can tell us a lot about where that light source is and how strong it is. And then what I'm going to do, this is a watered down white, by the way. I use a Golden brand fluid titanium white. So if you have the more heavy body or the regular consistency white, just add a bit of water to it, clean water. And I'm just going to add a glaze of this white at the below that over top the iris. Now just to get a bit more expression in these eyes so that I can add a bit more curiosity to the eyes, I'm going to just lift up the top of it. I don't want it so almond shaped. I want it almond shaped but a bit more of a curve up there so it's a bit wider. I also might need to go in with my dark gray and shape the pupil a little bit better. Now, throughout this tutorial, I do try to take regular pauses, but if I go too fast, be sure to use the pause and play button on your screen. All right, so I'm going to move on to the nose and filling in the nostrils with our black and outlining the nose. Notice we just have a little bit of a nostril right here showing, goes off the side of the canvas. So I'm going to start on the bottom of the nose where it's the darkest, because there's quite a, I didn't mean to make that so straight. We're actually going to round that part later, but I am going to bring this in closer to that line, the traceable line. So I'm working my way down around the bottom of the nose and off the side of the canvas, making sure that it curves there and curves back up again, and then we'll paint that line. Sometimes I'll keep my hand steady, I'll prop it up against my other hand. Now keep painting. If you're still working, no worries. I'm gonna add raw umber. Raw umber to my paint palette. And I'm not gonna outline the top of the nose because we're gonna use kind of a few colors here to add interest and to paint the top of the nose. So in a separate pile with my palette knife for mixing, I'm gonna mix up my raw umber with my black. I don't actually have much black. I'm gonna have to add more. Okay. And so that's raw umber, black, and white. Not too much white, but the inside of the nose is gonna mostly have this color as the base color of that dark colored nose. I think we'll add a little bit more of each raw umber, black, and some more white. What else I'm going to do is I'm going to pull some orange aside right next to it. I have a little bit of this brown on my palette knife, or you can just scoot some in. And that's just with orange with the color we were just using. I'll pull in a bit more orange. So it's mostly orange. So let's begin to talk about color theory and why I'm choosing the colors I am. Well, a lot of the time when I'm painting black or dark gray, dark brown dogs, I'll use violet and or phthalocyan blue. And to create contrast, an element of art that helps us balance paintings, I'm gonna add orange to complement the blue. And then I'm gonna add some sky blue, okay? For our next color, you're gonna need more white. In case you're running out, see what I mean? This is the golden fluid titanium white. I add a lot of white to my colors. And so, sky blue and white. And more sky blue. Well, I would say equal parts white and blue. We're going for a medium blue. Not a light, not a dark, but a medium value blue. And these are those beautiful colors that we're going to use to fill in the nose. So once you're ready, I'm going to encourage you to grab the size 2 filbert brush. Make sure it's clean and damp. And let's start with our first color. We have 3 core colors here for the nose. Now, because this value right here for our base layer is so dark, it could possibly cause us to lose the structure of the nose because it's so close to the value of what we use to fill in the nostrils and outline the bottom. So here's a little trick. I'm leaving a border around the nostrils, which is where it's going to be highlighted anyway, and I'll paint as close to that area as possible, but still leaving a little bit of an outline to indicate where those nostrils are, where the nose is, but on the outer edge, I'll go all the way out because we're not competing with other dark values there. Now, if you use this approach to paint dog noses, just be sure that you make sure you paint in the outline with the proper value. Sometimes it's very light, that outline. Sometimes it's not even there. And then sometimes it's more of a medium value. I'm going to cover over top this sketch line to go all the way around the bottom. And notice we have such a shadow that I went all the way up, didn't leave an outline right below this left side of the nose, but I still left it up a little higher. Now here's the thing. So we don't lose this line, I'm gonna go all the way up to the left side of this line indent, but not on the right. On the right side, I'll leave an outline. Again, this helps me maintain the anatomy and also helps me understand that light source and where the highlights are gonna sit. See what I mean? I left that white on the right of that indent. Now this highlight is more on that side. This highlight kind of comes down below here and then up on this side. So I will actually go all the way up, not leaving a white outline by the right nostril. All right, so I'm jumping back to my size 0 Arteza round brush. And next we're gonna pick up the orange brown. So it becomes more brown because of we mix it in with this dark brownish gray. And what I'm gonna do is add this beautiful orange brown to the far left side, top of the nose. Curving my brush strokes. And I won't go all the way up to the top, I'll go about there. I see a little bit of orange brown there, so we'll lighten that up in a little bit. But before we do, I also see it right here. Just a hint of it right there. Honestly, the more you paint, the more you'll start to see those hints of color. And then you can pull them out to make it more vibrant. Okay, so I washed off my brush so it's clean and damp. I'm now gonna I'm gonna test this out because it might be too light. Let's just test it out. It is, but you know what I can do? I can actually pull some of it aside, add some of this brown, just so I take away a little bit of that vibrancy and I just tone it down. Perfect. And that's what I'll do to paint in this outline we left. And I'm gonna fix up that curve that I cut into a little too much with my dark gray. I wanna curve the bottom of that nostril. So we tested out when in doubt. The core colors, those main colors that we mix up, so it's like 3 or 4 colors that we then pull from and mix other colors in separate piles. Sometimes, oftentimes, those core colors are a little too light, a little too dark, but we can use them to mix up the proper value. And we test it first. And I stopped here with my outline, with the darkness. See how I stopped here? So the outline goes to there. But I'm gonna stop with my blue about there because that highlight is only getting hit right there on the nose. So I just wiped a bit of that off and I'm gonna go back to that base color brownish gray and brought that white over. I just painted over the white outline. Now, do you know where else we're gonna add this blue mixed in? I'm gonna just mix up some more with a bit of our grayish brown with the blue. You know where else we can add this? If I carry this line down a little straight, but then curving right around that orange brown that we added, that's where there's also a highlight. Do you see it? So I'm going to mix up a little bit more of that brown with their blue so we can get the outline here. And we might have to adjust it. I might have added this line up a little too high, but we'll see. Goes all the way down. And with the little paint, I'm going to use the dry brush technique. If you watch me, with the little paint that I have left on my brush, I'm going to carry some of it over to the right. So it's adding a subtle layer over top that dark gray, dark brownish gray. I'll do the same thing. I still have more paint on my brush, and there's a slight curve to the right. And I think I'll take it over a little ways to the right. Now add a bit of water to your brush if you're having trouble pulling that paint over. Now what I'm doing right here, this is exactly why I chose to use the Fluid Titanium White by Golden brand. It keeps my paint wet on my brush for longer without clumping up my brush and getting it all sticky. But when I'm using the dry brush technique, using what little paint I have left on my brush to add a thin, subtle layer, I can work with that paint for longer with the Fluid Titanium White by Golden. Now, do you know where else there's a little bit of a highlight? It's very subtle, but it's right here. In fact, I'm going to spread the paint around to thin it out so it's not so prominent. So I only had a little bit of paint on the tip of my brush, added it, and then spread it around with my clean, damp brush. All right, so we may need to pull this down, but let's get the top part. So do you notice that we have this darkness, this gap of darkness, kind of like right here and right in here? And then right above it in this little area is getting the highlights. And we want to gradually progress from dark to light and then eventually get those little dots there. So I'm going to add even more of the brown to the blue. So in a separate pile, that's the brownish gray with the sky blue mixture. And let's create that space. I'm filling in this area. I'm not adding those dots yet. We'll add those for those top lighter layers. And this does go all the way to the top, but then wanes out underneath that orange brown. So I'll be pulling this over off the side of my canvas as well as curving it a little bit down and to the left. And this mixture we're pulling from with our sky blue, our gray brown that we used for the base for this nose. Be sure to hold on to it, even mix up some more. We'll use it in the next steps. Hi creatives, sorry to interrupt, but if you've been itching to paint your own beloved dog, cat, or even wanting to add to your income by eventually accepting your own pet portrait commissions, I have a great starting point and stress reliever. It was roughly 10 years ago when I felt like I was in this hopeless battle in addiction, depression, and anxiety. But I made the decision, one small decision, to draw and paint animals every day, along with listening to sermons, TED Talks, listening and watching painting tutorials. It was at my lowest that I made a tiny little choice that blossomed into a new creative practice, a new faith, and it eventually replaced those toxic habits and thought patterns with much healthier ones. So not only am I addiction free, I'm a mama of 2 littles, a wife, I'm a working art therapy practitioner, and I'm selling my pet and wildlife originals, prints, and commissions. And so that's the hope behind every original I paint and my Masterclass Bundle. So if you're somebody struggling with anxiety, depression, addiction, maybe you're going through cancer or divorce, in this bundle, there's over 250 pet and wildlife tutorials to choose from. It's a complete course. It contains my 12-step cat and dog pet portrait painting process, along with individual videos to demonstrate and dissect every single step. So if this would bless you or a friend that's really struggling right now, I have the link to the Masterclass Bundle down below. Let's get back painting. So what else I'm going to do is I'm going to go with this color. I'm going to add a bit more of the blue to it to lighten it up. And there is a small little line highlight, very small. I'm not along the far outside of the nose, but in just a smidge. And bring it down to this outline. I'll bring it up a little higher. All right, so we're getting a little bit lighter. We're going to get a little bit lighter now. I'm going to pull in more orange into a corner, little pile, pulling in the orange brown into that. Okay, so that's a little bit more orange into that orange brown. I'll add a little bit of white. That's kind of how I often like to lighten things up. Let's just test this out to see if this is okay. So I'm emphasizing the orange there, so that's just good enough. It might be a little too light. We'll see. And right to the left of this highlight we just made, and on the right of it, on the top of the nose, on this left top side of the nose, I'm going to add this slightly lighter value of orange brown. Now you see how I left that outline? I don't want that. I don't want any sort of outline to be there. So I'm actually going to pull it into some of those browns and blues. Join that a little bit better. I'll add that a little bit lighter. So this is another layer of that orange brown, the lighter version. All right, so my brush is clean and damp, and that's really important for this next part. This next part, we're gonna go in with our blue, not adding any gray to it. And if you watch me over top this strip that we added of our blue brown, brownish gray, I'm gonna add our dabs. Now to achieve this technique, I recommend a small round brush like this one, or better yet, a small spot brush. And you only apply paint to the tip of your brush. We're using our sky blue and white mixture. Otherwise, your dots start to get too large. They start to be a bit blobby in shape. You want them to have small gaps in between and be relatively neat and around the same size. And notice I'm not going in with straight white or even a light gray. This is like a medium, almost light blue. I'm going to add just a couple over top some of the orange over here. And I'm going to go to the color of the blue grayish brown that's left over, because I want a few down here, but it's not going to be as light. And that's going to help us join this part with the top of the nose, that highlight around the line indent. You know where else I'm going to bring some dots? Closer to the side of the nostril, down here, over top, still this base layer of grayish brown. We'll also add some dots right alongside the highlight around the nostril, on the bottom of the nostril, and on the other highlight. So you only want to apply this technique if you can see the texture. If the dog's face is so close to the viewer that you can make out these dots. But if you're painting a full body dog portrait where the dog is very far away, you're not going to need to add this kind of detail. Now that layer has dried, I'm going to do it again. I only want to add a thin amount of paint to the tip of my brush so it's not thick with paint. I'm not loading my brush up, okay? There's still just a little bit of paint on there. And I'm going to go over some of those dabs I've already made and making a few more. And notice I'm not bringing them all the way up to the top. I'm kind of keeping them in the center because that light source is more front on, as we can tell by that highlight. I'm going to curve these highlighted dots down here a little bit more in between the oranges and the brown grays. You know where else I'm going to add this? I'm going to get a bit stronger highlights of this light blue right below here. This is on the first line highlight directly below the nostril. I'll also add a few dots to give it a more texture on the other highlight on this part of the nostril. So there's different ways we just apply to emphasize highlights by not even adding lighter dots. We can make the gaps between dots closer together, so smaller, so it's more clustered and condensed with dots, or we can make the size of the dots larger. So those are just different methods using placement and size, but we will be adding more white to this sky blue so we can go in with another round of dots. Now going back to this darker version of our blue with the added brown gray and some of our blue, let's add a bit of texture along this side. I'm just adding more bumps, more texture along that highlight here. This isn't a different mixture. This is just me making sure I only have a little bit of paint on my brush. So I'm like twisting it to try and get some of those clumps off. I'm going to add more lightness to this highlight here. I even brought it up just a smidge with some dabs. And then what we're going to do, when you're ready, I'm going to add white to this pile. So now I'm going to add white to this pile. Make sure you still pull some of that paint off so you just have a little bit of paint on the end of your brush. And let's highlight those dots. So right, this like line of dots right here, I'm going to lighten those up. So I am adding more dots, but mostly highlighting the ones that are already there. I might have brought it over too far. So you know what I can do with that? Go back to your gray-brown and cut in around some of them if you brought it down too far. In fact, you want to revisit that dark value, that base layer anyway when you're working on noses. This is important. That base layer, you want to make sure you mix up enough so you can revisit that layer to cut around some of these medium value dots. I'm literally outlining around them to kind of emphasize that dog texture and further show where that light source is hitting the strongest. And I can even bring this highlight down a little bit with dabs and dots. But that top area still looks a little too light to me, so I'm gonna not use this light blue. I'll just add some dots of our grayish blue. So this is just the light blue with some of our gray brown. And I'll highlight this a little bit with more dabs than dots. I'm almost like subtly covering it up, but also still adding that texture. This is just a friendly reminder to breathe. Take deep breaths in through your nose and a long exhale out through your mouth. And something I really like to do, continue painting if you're still working, but I will add all the dark, medium, and lights to what I think, and then revisit the darkest darks. So I'll do another outline around the nostrils with dark gray, and even darken up some of our darkest base colors. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to pull aside some of our mixture of brown gray, add a little bit more black to it, and then right where it's the darkest part, right here, I'll darken that up. Same right in between that dark nostril. I'll even add a little bit more black here. Right along the nostril and that highlight. I'm going to do some dabs to kind of add more texture over top some of those blues. Even bring that darkness up around some of those dots. And you know where else we can add this that I bet might surprise you is right here. Darkness right there. Dab, 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 right above that blue highlight. It's actually quite dark right there. Another dark area. So I actually have to mix up some more, just a bit of black in our brownish gray, is in between this little gap right here, more dabs. And we have our dark gray, so if you need to do any adjustments to the inner nostril where we use dark gray. Just because I think it needs it. Our blue mixed in with our gray. Little more dabs closer in towards that line indent. I just think I made that gap a little bigger than it needed to be. And to improvise, I'm going to add some more texture there. See how I did it down here too on both sides? So we've done the eyes, the nose, and we actually have to finish off the mouth. And it's so simple. I'm just going to use my size 1 Arteza round brush to simply fill in with our dark gray, with the clean damp brush, this area right here. We're going to add quite a bit of it here. It seems like too much, but you'll see how much fur, little strands of hair that we layer over top. And when you've done that step, I'm going to set this brush aside. I've washed it off. I've refreshed my water. I recommend you do the same. And because we're going to be working on the dark fur using blue and violet. So that's the colors I'll be adding to my paint palette. This is violet, and I'll be adding phthalo cyan and blue. Get a bit more purple on there. All right, so hopefully you still have more of the dark gray. We're going to be using that still for some of these dark values. So whenever you're ready, I have my palette knife again. I'm going to pull aside some violet and some phthalo blue and a bit of dark gray. So again, that's dark gray, violet, and phthalo blue. A little helpful color mixing tip. I've mentioned the word core colors. Those are the colors that we mix up, and then we can pull from those colors to get the right value. Well, I recommend mixing up at least 3 colors, a dark, a medium, and a light value. It's just so much easier when we already have the dark, medium, and light value. We can do the blending technique. We can also mix other colors from those core colors. For the next color, I'll pull some of that into the next color. And that's simply just adding more of the violet and the blue and white. All right, so this is a little bit lighter. This is a medium value. Now I encourage you to get real creative here with color. If you want to add more blue and make this more of a blue dog, add more blue or more purple. We're going to be adding some yellow to the background so it really complements those yellows. All right, I'm going to pull some of this aside. I'm going to add lots more white. Now you can see each color kind of pulls from the previous one, but you don't always have to do that. You can start fresh and mix an entirely different color, different value. It's just a helpful when we're painting fur because we will be using a lot of blending that gets a little bit lighter with each layer over top. I like to work on one body part area at a time with the darker values first, blending gradually to those lighter values. And I'll like to start with the dark fur first and then move on to the white or the lighter fur or light markings. All right, so I'm back with my size 2 Arteza Filbert brush. So do you notice, let's just talk value for a second. Do you notice how dark this shape, this dark value is? It's got this shape to it as well. So values, we're looking for the darkest ones only right now, create a shape. So as we paint the value, which could be any color as long as it's the relative lightness or darkness, we're also going to create a shape. Now those dark values will blend into medium values, just slightly lighter, and then gradually go to even lighter to the light values. So let's begin with our filbert brush in this darkest shape here, right above that eye. Now, I'm also being careful about the direction my brush strokes are moving. I want them to go up and to the left, because kind of see how that fur texture is curving. I'll bring this, even though there's highlights that I see here, I'm just focusing on that dark value, and I can always blend or layer over top those lighter highlights that I'm seeing. Now I have a little too much water in my brush, so just be careful about that yourself. All right, so do you notice how it kind of trails off and gets a little lighter? Well, that's where I'm going to blend some of our medium value into some of this. So if you watch my brush strokes kind of turn, I'm going over, I'm pulling in some of this dark value, and I'm turning while also covering up some more of that white. Now, again, I can layer those light values and strands over top this, which is why I'm going to bring it all the way to that line. And down. You see how there's these little strands that cut out? We'll not worry about those yet, but I do notice how this dark value is pretty dark beneath those strands, which is why I pulled in more of the dark value right here along this line. But right up here, I'm wisping it up and around because it goes from dark to a little bit lighter. All right, in this stage, I've raised the bar just a little bit. We're getting a little bit more complex. I also have to maintain a relatively steady pace so that these colors don't dry and we can work wet into wet. But quick review, as we're creating the shape of the value, we're paying attention to the direction of the fur while gradually blending from our dark to our medium value. So before that area dries, I'm going to take this medium value because, do you notice, there's just a little bit of lightness right here, and I'm blending that in with some of the dark value. When I first started painting animals, I could barely see the different values, but now I can identify many ranges of dark, medium, and light values within a reference. So I encourage you just to not get discouraged here. It takes time. After painting lots of animals, I am starting to really develop that eye for the different, very subtle and loud values. This medium value, just the medium value on my brush, there's no added dark value. Up and around. I'm working alongside this light value. Still too much water on my brush. This filbert brush holds a lot of water. And I'm going to paint this all the way to this traceable line. But do you notice it starts to kind of get darker here along the side? All right, before I move on to that darkness, I'm going to pull this up to that line. I'm actually not going to add much paint to my brush. I have actually just a little bit, it's more watery on my brush, and I'm only adding a little bit of paint. So it's almost like a wash. The reason I'm doing this is because it is so highlighted here I want to really make sure I don't lose that line. So that's a technique that's just going to help show, okay, there's a highlight there. And beneath it, we have our medium value. So another way to do that is just dilute that color, add more water to your brush, dilute it like that, and then just add that wash. So that's the wash technique, where you're adding a very diluted color over the white of your canvas. Because we don't want to get too caught up in detail just yet with our highlights and all those details, I applied a wash. This can be helpful for beginners as you're mapping out these dark and medium values, that highlights belong in a certain area where you've left the wash. Going back to my dark value, because I mentioned, did you notice how it kind of gets dark along this side of the face? So it's like here it's a little bit lighter, a little bit more of a medium value, but here along that ear gets a bit darker. And don't worry about the wispy hairs yet. That comes later. We're filling in more white. This is kind of what our focus is, to cover up the white, lay down the dark and medium values and some light values. I'm going to cover up the white and get a little darker here. I am stretching this down along that curl, and then I'll go to about there. We'll do something fun for that ear. That's my funnest. I like that part of this process the most. Okay, so I washed off my brush. It's clean and damp. You ready? Going in with the medium value again. And I'm painting now to the left of the eye carefully. Oh, too much paint on my brush. That's probably why. Just leaving too much water and paint on my brush. You got to be careful about that with the filbert brush. And carefully below that eye, maintaining that point. Okay. Now you notice that traceable line right here and here. This is kind of boxing in that really dark shadow, that shadow being created from the ear, okay? So I'm gonna bring this down just a little bit more to that line, maybe a little over that line. And then I'm gonna grab my dark value. That dark value is gonna connect to the shadows that we just painted up here, okay? And blend at this kind of vertical, but once it's in here, it kind of curves that way, up into that medium value. I'm gonna add a little bit more because I brought down the medium value a little too low. And I'm kind of helping to shape that side of the face. So take a peek at your reference just so you can really see that better as you're shaping this value. So I'm filling in the darkest part here, the shaded area, with the dark value, right along this traceable line. I'm going to bring this shadow down slightly closer to that eye. See how I'm doing that? I just barely pushed on my brush, so I'm kind of blending it so it takes that shadow in a little bit more. Now this area for you should still be wet, but if it's not, you can just actually mix a bit of our medium value with the dark value if it's dry. So what I mean by that is just a little bit of the medium value with a little bit of the dark value. Before I move on, I want to catch this. I just want to darken this slightly more here. Right at the base, like right there. Might go over with just to get it a bit darker and kind of box in that highlight we'll be emphasizing it a little bit by the eye. Okay, so I have a clean damp filbert brush. When you're ready, we'll go back to our medium value before this dries. Okay, so here we go with our medium value. Carefully working underneath that outline. I will leave that white, not only because I need a smaller brush and I'll use this brush, but also because I want to highlight that. So I'll just continue, make this simple. We'll just continue with this medium value. I want to work along this line with the medium value. And we're going to have to attach it. This is probably dry, but we're going to have to attach it to some of those darks there. So let's just paint in this area, and then keeping a steady pace, we can blend in the darks. And I left that white so I can highlight that in a bit. All right, so it looks a little funny now, but we can shape that now with our dark value. Or, just like I said, a mix between the medium and the dark, which is right here. So first things first, let's connect with these upward curving brush strokes. Blend right here into some of those medium values with our dark value. I'm going to have to make this a bit darker. It's getting a little too light. And it kind of comes up like that. You see how the lines kind of come up? Do you also see there's some lines over here? Oh, I pulled off some of those dark values. I don't want to do that. Some of those lines at that angle. Do you know what I'm saying? Know what I'm saying here? I'm just trying to pull it, that darkness, up into the medium value that way and downwards from this shadow here. Oh, I covered up that highlight. Silly me. And the last one before this area dries, I have just the dark value. I even went down further into some of that white because it gets really dark down here. And if this is dried for you, just pull in more of the medium value. We want a gradual fade from our medium value to this dark value, so you might need to pull in a little bit more of that medium value. And you know what? We can even go all the way down to about there. I should have brought up some of the background, but I'll bring it to about there with our darkest value. Now, if you haven't painted that gap between the ear and the chest, if you recall, I missed it when we were painting our background. And if you too haven't yet done that, be sure to use our background peach color and paint that gap in. I washed off my filbert brush. I'm gonna moving on in with this is my size 1 round brush. I'm gonna do a mix between our light value and our medium value. I'm gonna use that to paint in here in this little white that I left. And also add that little highlight above the left of the eye. So we've blended in our dark and our medium values. Now mixing in some of that medium value to a light value, we're adding those top layers gradually from dark to light. So we're not jumping straight to those lightest values just yet. Dab, dab, dab. So I'm not just doing one line, I'm doing textured lines up along this curve. And I kind of trailed off into some smaller dabs up the top. Now this is really important. What I see a lot of beginner artists do is they jump too light too soon. So to avoid this, simply add a slightly lighter value like white, like yellow, to your previous medium value that you were just using. Just a little bit lighter. So once you're done with that step, we're going to mix some of our medium value in with the light value. Now this is the slightly tricky part. I'm making this value contain more of the medium value. This line, this highlight beneath the eye, is not as light as those highlights we just added above and in that corner of the eye. Now with that same value we were just using, we're going to jump down and work on the left of the bridge of the nose. I'm using the blending technique, which is why I'm going to need to pull in more of the medium value. And I won't pull that down all the way to where we mixed in the dark value, but I want to lighten this area up, right to the left of that white fur on the bridge of the nose. I just want to subtly highlight that and even pull it up a little higher where we'll be adding those little light colored fur there. And it also, I can pull that highlight down at an angle like this. So it's like in front of that highlight at the same angle. I'm going to add more of that medium value mixed in with some of the light value. All right, see how I'm kind of wisping my brush strokes now? A little bit more wispy, less dabby. Also going to do a little bit more wispy right here. I'm looking for those subtle medium values. Sometimes all we need is just a few wisps, a few lines to add it in. Nowhere else? Right here, a little bit more wispy. I'll pull in a little bit more of the light value, then the medium value up here. I'm going to blend in even more of the light value as I cluster these curving lines around the brow. All right, so once you have that down, the other side should be easy peasy. When you're ready, I'll switch to my filbert brush, just because we have a bit more area to paint in. All right, let's start with a clean damp filbert brush. Dark value first in this little gap, which goes off the side of our canvas. The light is out. I can see better now. Looked like it was gonna rain. Okay, right in. I didn't even wash off my brush actually. Right in with our medium value to curve these brush strokes around that shape of that dark value. Again, going off the side of our canvas up here. then a clean damp brush, back with the medium value. But you know what? I'm going to add some of the light value mixed with the medium value. So that's what I did. Medium with the lighter, I should say, and paint all the way over, curving those brush strokes over. Even in this step, we curve those brush strokes. And then with my size 0, my size 1 round brush, let's get lighter and blend that in with our wisps, just like we did over here. The beginnings of that lighter hair. We'll add lots more texture with actual strands over top this, but we're just gonna begin to add the texture and that value. See how I kind of left gaps, even gaps in between? I also want to, while I'm here, I want to bring this over a bit more. So I finally realized that I have more of that background to paint in here. And while we're here, if you also care to add a second layer to your background to make that a beautiful, rich, vivid peach, go for it. I'm also going to do the same. I'm going to add another layer myself. After you've done that, let it sit for 5-10 minutes, and then we'll get back painting. Now, as you heard me share not too long ago in this tutorial, I mentioned that when I was deep in recovery, I would fill my mind with good, wholesome things. I would listen to sermons. I would go research the animal that I was painting, get to know more about them, really develop this connection with the animal. I would pull out a Bible verse and just chew on that over and over again as I was painting, trying to also bring that into my artwork. So I want to share one with you today that really helped me then, still helps me so much now. James 1, verse 5, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. Whenever you're trying to let go of toxic habits, toxic thought patterns, it's confusing, it's overwhelming, it's scary, you feel alone. And for me personally, I always tried to ask God, give me wisdom, God, give me my next step, help me not to fall. So it was painting, dwelling on animals, dwelling on His word, and keeping in hope that really did help guide me to that next step, that next right decision. And I just hope this gives you encouragement today that you're not doing this alone, that God can implant His wisdom into you and creativity simply by inviting Him in right where you are, no matter what you've done. He can give you this free gift of wisdom. Okie dokie. So I'm going to encourage you to grab your size 5 angle brush. This is our angle brush, and we're going to go in with a clean damp brush. I'm going to go in with our medium value. Okay, so that was just our phalocyanum blue, violet, and white. And then we started with our dark value, then added even more white to get our medium value. So if you're running low like me on these different values, our core colors, I recommend you mix some more up. We're especially going to use that medium value to fill in the entire ear. I use a very different technique for painting upright dog ears or cat ears, but for this long, fluffy, curly-haired ears, this is my technique. We're going to fill in the entire ear with our medium value, getting in around all those curves. I switch, the point now is on the inside to get that nice clean edge on the inside of the ear. See how I did that? I'm now working opposite. I'm gonna bring up that curl just a little bit more. I'm gonna emphasize that because that highlight kind of stops there. So I'm gonna bring that up a little bit for that very reason. I'm gonna mix up some more, so I'll just take a bit of this and then add more white to it. Now, can I encourage you, if this is the first time you're painting a dog portrait or the first time painting ever, give yourself some grace, first and foremost. Perfection is never, ever attainable, especially not after the first try, even the third or fifth try. What is attainable, however, is growth and a new, fresh perspective. Now this ear goes off the bottom of our canvas, so I'll bring it all the way down to the bottom. And you know what we're gonna do? While we're here, because the bottom of that ear gets so dark, I'm gonna blend some of that dark value into the medium value. It's the bottom that's the darkest part. And of course the sides, don't forget about that. And this doesn't have to be perfectly blended, perfectly blended, because we're going to use lines soon. All right, now I'm kind of going a little fast because we want to keep working while it's wet into wet with this next step. I want to use this angle brush. Now the edge of my angle brush, okay? So you might want to watch me first. I'm not going to follow all the reference perfectly, but I am going to look for those visual cues that tell me more about where those shadows sit. So for example, I see how there's this beautiful curl that goes out right here in the middle of the ear, but then there's a pretty dark gap right here, and then more fur down here. I'm going to create this shadow with the dark value and kind of section off single lines and clumps. Notice how I'm curving and twisting my brush using that flat edge of my angle brush. And then it curls the other way because we're dealing with curly, long fur on this ear. And then, so there's two clumps there. And then it gets a bit darker underneath here, and that curl, I sectioned off that curl right there and then filled some space in. So right now we're just mapping out those shadows, looking underneath and around those curls. So mapping out the clumps and the single lines, trying to use that medium value as the negative space, working around that first base layer, but not covering it up entirely. And if we get it wrong, if we make it look a little wonky, easy peasy, we can go back with our medium value and fix it up and readjust it. Now here I see some clumps. So I'll create two clumps right there and also make the side darker because it gets a bit darker on this side, doesn't it? By the way, I need to pull some of the gray in with the phthalo blue and violet with a tiny bit of white to mix up more of this dark value. Again, that's dark gray, violet, phthalo blue, and a bit of white to get the dark value. So going underneath these clumps, now these clumps are going to be layered up a little higher. So I'm going to kind of cut into the bottom of them with this dark value, curving my brush strokes there, So we'll be able to layer over top the dark value at the end of that line. A clump there, I'll put a clump right there. I just left some of that medium value. And then right above it, it gets darker. There's some darkness here and out, so I cut in at an angle to the side, and then right above it here where it curves, I'm going to add another dark line. To create depth, you'll have a lot of those front curls sticking out over top our background be up higher, and then the ones behind it being a bit lower. And I like to work in and around those bumps to map out curls around there. It's those clumps in front and behind that really helps to create that perspective. Now, why I'm not going to let that dry is so I can go back with this brush and the medium values now and refine these lines. For example, the one that I kind of painted over too much is right here. And this is going to blend, which is what we want, okay? So I'm curving my brush strokes right here where I see the highlights of the peak of the curl. It's like waves. The peak, the top is going to be highlighted the most. We'll lighten up those areas with our medium values and light values. The trough where it dips down is going to get our dark and medium values. Then the end of this curl on these two clumps that I sectioned off are going to be lighter up top here. But look, they get a bit darker down here. Ugh, too dark. So I'm going to just get that slightly darker, but not too much darker. So if you missed that step, I added more of the same base layer medium value on the ends of the curls, even added a bit more curl, and then slightly darkened up those areas in between with adding a little bit of the dark value to the medium value. All right, going back to my medium value, I want to add another curl right in between here. It's like overlapping that area. So I just curled it down in that. And then these points, these little strands, we're gonna go over top our background after we've painted in the inside with our dark value lines. So with this second layer, we're adjusting the medium value, adding a little bit more lightness or darkness to them, and adding in more curls. As you saw, I overlapped another one, creating another clump. Now I'm going to go back to my dark value because I see that I can actually use the point of my brush to create two clumps right here. So I'm going to actually change things up a little bit to my reference. I'm going to have clumps going off to the angle and then more clumps out there. I'm going to create a shaded area with my dark value right there. Thin strands and clumps are going to go in all sorts of different directions. Again, test it out, and if you like it, keep it. If not, just paint over it and try again. And also darkness curving around the outside of this clump here in front of it. See how I did that? And then I'll section off this too. So now that was a bit difficult to get this one, which is why I'm going to my size 1 round brush to separate that into two clumps with my dark value. For example, I'm going to bring this down and in because this is a little confusing. What I think I might do is just darken up the trough of this curl and then keep that light. So it goes back up again here, down, back up. Just another reminder to take deep breaths in through the nose, out through the mouth. If you're feeling challenged right now, maybe a little frustrated, this is a normal, common part of the process for artists of all levels. We got to lean into this. This is how we can make progress, by making mistakes. I notice though, I tend to absorb what I'm learning way better when I'm not distracted, when I'm taking those deep breaths, slowing down and just taking it one step at a time. All right, you ready? So I'm actually going to mix up more of our medium value. I'm going to mix up the more of both. So let's get some phalocyanin blue and violet, bit of dark gray and white. This is our dark value. That's actually not too dark, so I'm going to add more violet, more phthalo blue, and more of our gray. Pull some of that aside and we add more white. That's going to be our medium value. I'm going to add a little bit more blue just because we have a lot of violets here. I'm going to add more white and more phthalo blue. Okay. So when you're ready, I'm going to use, this is my size 0 Arteza round brush. And I'm going to go in with our medium value that we just mixed up. And carefully what I'm going to do, let's start with the peaks, okay, where they're the lightest. I'm going to do not just highlight the whole clump, but actually lines within that clump. And that's not that light. So I'm going to add a little bit more white to that, just in a kind of a separate pile to get this a little bit lighter. So like waves, at the top of that wave, the peak, it's going to be the lightest point. We're going to get the most amount of light hitting that point. The trough, where it dips down, where it's darker, it's not going to get as much light. I'm going to skip that area, move to the next curl that is raised up. I'm highlighting using clusters of lines within these clumps. Now, as long as the value you're using is not too light, you can add additional clumps and single lines. That's what I'm doing right here. Now, in some cases, like what I'll show you next, if your value is slightly lighter, you can redo your work with this value. Here I'm adding a peak using 4 lines, curving those lines around this little bump right here. Notice that I don't bring those lines all the way down because that's where the trough, that dip is going to be. I skip an area, I move on to the next highlight. Again, make sure this value isn't too light. And if you have really wide dark shadows, like gaps that are just too big, you can add in more single lines or clusters of lines to create those clumps. I'm doing that right here, making this cluster, this clump, a little smaller, kind of hidden underneath the other curls. You also don't only want vertical curving lines. Get them horizontal so they're curving out to the left or out to the right. If you're still not quite sure about keeping the direction of the curls and clumps from our negative space, the base value of medium, you can change it up here. Change up the direction like I am right here. What's important though, as we're working our way down towards the bottom of that ear, we really want to keep those values on the dark side because that's where it's not getting much light, not only because it's towards the bottom, but also because it's going to be covered up with those very light whiskers. So we want to keep this dark. But thankfully for us, acrylics does dry darker. It looks a lot darker than what we see when it's wet. So right now I'm working to thin out those shadows, making them less obvious. I don't want huge gaps between curls. I can add a few medium values in between there and really lighten up the ends of the curls like I'm doing here. I'm going to pull on a bit of the dark value as I work down here where it's not as light. And I'm going to curl these the other way at the bottom. Now it's very easy to overdo it with these lines. We don't want to entirely cover up all the shadows. And even if you did, that's okay. In a moment, we're going to revisit our dark values. Get rid of some of the medium values that we don't want, really define some of those troughs, and tighten things up. All right, I'm going to revisit the dark values. Before I move on to the highlights, I can paint over any areas that don't look quite right in this point, in this stage. So now we want to reestablish those prominent shadows that we want to keep. We also want to use lines to feather in some of those troughs, joining them with the ends of those curls, also slimming out some of those clumps or those single lines. I'm going to start pulling some of this for like leaving gaps of the background. So now I'm creating these little loops, boxing in little bits of that background showing from behind. Not going over the chest just yet. We want to paint that chest area and then we can do this again. All right, let's get a little bit lighter. So with I'm actually going to switch brushes so I can get a little bit lighter. This is my size 0 Arteza round brush. Make sure it's clean and damp. Now I'm going to go in with the light value, the one we used up here, just a little bit. Careful without pushing too hard on this because we want to go over the medium values with this light value. We don't want to go over the dark values, but over the medium values. With those final top layer highlights, we're often, almost always, going to use smaller brushes. It's the base layers and those 1, 2, 3 layers that are going to be our larger and medium-sized brushes. So we're going dark to light, big brushes to our smallest detail brushes. And where we can find those final highlights is where we've already placed the medium values, where it's getting hit by the most amount of light. I'm also being very intentional about every single line, even more so than when I applied the previous layers, because it's lighter values that indicate and pull things forward darker values, and especially cooler, darker values, move to the back. And so right now we're indicating those curls are raised up, and so every line counts. I'm also leaving very small gaps in between lines over top those clumps and those medium value lines. All right, I'm gonna go back to my medium value because I see where I can like overlap some of the curls. You see how I'm doing that? Overlapping some of these curls over top some of the dark areas. And drawing out some of the areas like up here that I want to lighten up a little more. All right, going back to my light value again for right out here. All right, back to my dark values again. Are you starting to see it now with these layers? We build up from dark to medium to light, but then we repeat rounds of those dark, medium, and light values. And we've mixed up a range of dark, medium, and light values, pulling from those core colors. But it's at this point also that the temptation to overwork and overlayer, and sometimes less is more. So we also still have more white to cover up. And so step back, look at your piece, and be careful not to overdo it. All right, now the medium values. This point, I'm going to do a mix between my medium and my dark value. And that's what I want to do to now carefully cut some of the wispy hairs on the outside, on the outer edge. So I have some hairs like this one that are sticking out like that, and then some hairs that are sticking out the opposite direction. So I'm both following along where I see those curls already that we've painted and adding a few more lines right alongside it. So they're going in all sorts of directions, but always with a bit of a curve. I'm going to work up even along the side of the head with some of these strands. Now for these strands up top here, I'm going to switch to my size 0 liner brush, get it clean and damp, and with very thin, wispy brush strokes, I'm going to carefully just only adding paint to the tip of my brush, almost like whiskers. I'm going to have these hairs coming from the the top of the head. And just remember, if you do mess up or you want to cut out some of the lines, we can always paint over it with our background color. I'm going to go to my medium value for a few on the outside here of this curl. And I'm going to bring in this dark value a little bit more than I have it. I'm going to bring it in. So a lot of these hairs on the left side of the forehead are overlapping, and then kind of flowy, wispy hairs that are kind of blowing in the wind. A little bit of a bad hair day, so they don't have to look super polished. It's a bit unkempt. That's what we're going for. Now a little change of pace here. I'm going back to that highlight above the eye, and on the right of that highlight that kind of goes up along that curve, I'm going to add a bit of texture here using the dark value with my liner brush, getting rid of that weird sharp dark line. I don't want that. I want it to look like furry, and so that's why I'm adding it to that right side of that highlight. All right, another round of light values. Now this is so important and something I actually recently discovered. The final top highlights, the lightest highlights that are almost white that I'm adding right now, I will find those places where I've already added the highlights and join those highlighted lines. I'll like connect them, only in a few areas. And so that's what I'm doing here. It gives it even more of a realistic shine. I think down here I need more of my medium values than my light. If it doesn't make sense, like add a wispy hair of using a medium value overlapping it. Like I just did there. Anywhere it doesn't make sense, try to connect it with a medium value. Or start over with the dark value. Like you can just paint over it with the dark. Like for instance here, I'm going to darken it up because it should be dark down here as it goes into that trough. All right, so I showed you those final top highlights. What about the final shadows? We want to gradually progress from dark to light, from the trough to the peak. And so that's why with our dark and medium values, we're going in and around that almost middle point between the trough and the peak. So anywhere on our curls, the darkest points and the lightest points, where it's too big of a jump from light to dark and no in between, that's where we want to pull in our medium values to join them. And yet another technique that helps us to join these with not just the value, but the actual line texture, like I'm going to demonstrate right here with my dark values, cutting up, feathering into those light values from the trough, that also helps to create that smooth transition from light to dark. Now, before we move on to that light fur, I just want to do a few extra values that we are leaving out. I actually painted over one that we're going to paint back in. I'm going to test this medium value out with the extra blue. So it's going to be so nice having a bit more blue here. And it's right above that point of the eye with the medium value. I can also whisk my brush, dry brush technique, so what little paint I have left on my brush, I can pull up that medium value a little higher. With my medium value, I want to wisp more of these lines very subtly. I already did it with the purple, but I'm going to do a little bit more with the blue underneath the eye. And even some that are cutting not just down, but over. See that? Some blue medium value over into some of that dark value line that went up. I'll add some medium value blues cutting here into some of those purples that kind of blended with the dark value purples. And some here. In fact, I'm going to get that a little lighter. I'm going to get that a little lighter here, where we just did that, and here. You know what? I'm going to add another dab of this light value blue there too. Now, hopefully you still have more of your dark, medium, and light value for the fur. Believe it or not, but we're going to actually add some here for the dark values and then blend to a gray. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix that gray. I'll just take some of our raw umber and black mixture. So it's going to be a grayish brown. Add lots of white to it. It's like all my white. I'm going to have to add more white. And we have our other values that we were just using. That's what we'll start with. So once you're done mixing that up, we'll get started right under here with our size 1 Arteza round brush. I'm going to start with the medium value. I want to test it out. Okay, it's actually not dark enough. So I'm going to pull in more of the dark value and work to the left of that line indent and right below the nose, but not all the way. You'll have to watch me for when I stop, and on the right side of the upper lip. We're doing this because the fur is so thin that we can actually see the dark markings, dark skin area beneath that. So we'll add that as a base layer first and then blend into our gray. Now, instead of going over all the way, I'll actually just go up around the bottom of the nose, kind of staying right here. All right, I don't have any down here, and we'll add in over top the grays some of the other markings. So now with that on my brush still, using these kind of wispy angled brush strokes. If you missed that, I pulled in some of our light gray with a lot on my paintbrush so we can add some really decent evident texture here with these brush strokes that are going up at an angle, cutting into that blue, but also covering up more of the white. And the closer I get to the outer edge, that left side of the muzzle, I'm pulling in just our light gray. And just be sure you pull in, notice how I'm doing that? I'm kind of pulling in some of this blue or this light gray into the blue. I wipe off my brush so I can kind of clean this up. And then move out with the gray. Now, preferably you want to actually have a little bit of, so I'm going to add a little bit of the blue here. Not too much, but just to separate the bottom lip from the grays that we'll add there. And then go back to your gray for working up. Oops, went out a little too far. I'm going to clean that up. I went out a little too far. Just grab my dark gray, my dark indigo, clean that up, wash it up, and you know what? I can actually switch brushes because I'm just going up with the gray. And I think what we'll do it is a size 5 angle brush. So once you're at that point, when you're ready, you can switch to the angle brush. I'm using the point of this angle brush again to work carefully around that nose. I actually cut off some of my nose. Going to go in with my dark gray there. Get that back in there. And then paint in the rest. Now I am using the point to kind of cut over because it's over on that side and layers over top that side. So as you're painting, let's chat for a little bit about how we paint white fur or very light fur. Well, as you know by now, we want to build layers with acrylics from dark to medium to light. But with white fur, we don't want to make it look as if it's dark fur. So that would mean we can't use a dark value or something dark at all for the base layer. We want to actually start with a medium value for that base layer. Then you can slightly darken the areas getting the least amount of light and or use dark values for any markings or spots or indents in and around that white fur. And then that top final layer will be almost white. Sometimes it is white, for those top layers over top light fur. Now I'm actually going to squeeze in here some yellow ochre. Got in with some of my cad yellow. That'll be interesting. Maybe even add a little bit more yellow in there. I'm going to mix up, I'll set this aside so I can mix it up with my palette knife. I'm going to add a little bit of gray. That's the raw umber with our black, so the brownish gray. Yellow, this is yellow ochre. And let me add more white directly in there. We want this a darker value, slightly darker. Not too dark, but darker because it's not getting as much light. So now we're finally covering up the white with this yellowish gray brown for the chest area and a little bit of the lip. I'll go back to my angle brush. Let's test this out. Once you have it mixed up, excellent, that actually is lovely. First, I'm gonna work underneath the chin, just filling it in with my size 5 angle brush. But then I'm going to go back with my size 0 round brush, go back with this color, add in some of this. I know that sounds silly, but we're going to do a mix of the two. So they're too close in value. If I brought that all the way down, I would lose it. So let's grab a little bit, of the gray. So that's the raw umber with the gray. And blend that in below the chin. And while we're here, let's just start with this brush coming down from that chin with those lines. Now this is the same technique we applied to the ear. We first applied a medium value, and then now with our darks, we're cutting in, but now vertically with curving clusters of lines, leaving clumps and single lines that will then define with our highlights. Just so I can then distinguish the chin from the bottom of the neck. While we're here, let's just blend some of that gray a bit more into this mixture right here, a corner of the mixture, by the way. Now I'm actually making a bit of a mistake here. Can you spot it? This gray needs to be directly beneath the muzzle and chin and come down from there, because that's where a shadow is being created. Even also here in this corner from that ear, it's going to be actually lighter below around the mid chest compared to directly below the face. So we need to actually have that up there and pull our lines or curving lines down. So you'll see I eventually get there, but we can learn from that mistake right here. And I'll wash off my brush, and when you're all done with that for the first layer, then we can go back with this mix, because we don't want it as light as this, right here on the chin. Now we can see that chin, we can make it out. And where it would be darker, just like we found some dark areas here, while that's still wet, I'll add in some more gray into a corner of this mixture. And right here, it's going to be darker. Using clusters of lines, I'm going to bring that down to the left side and over a bit. A little bit more is needed right here. And over. So next what I'm going to do is add even more dark strands from the ear layered over top the neck. So let's go back. We might have to add some more dark gray to this dark value if it's not dark enough, because it's pretty dark in this corner. I'm going to add some curls over top that neck into some of that gray. Now another area we can add this gray, and it's subtle, is right above the nose, okay? I'm gonna first lay down a line that curves above this nose, the top of it, and then start doing these brush strokes that go up. By the way, in case you were wondering, this is our yellow gray brown that we added additional gray brown to, okay? It's not super dark, but it's closer to the dark values that we were using beneath the chin and muzzle. So we're trying to achieve very short, tightly clustered lines that are more vertical, but to the left, they kind of curve out more to the left. On the right side, they curve out more to the right. Then what I'm gonna do is with a clean, damp brush, I'm gonna spread that paint and like get rid of any of those harsh lines. This is with a clean, damp brush. There's no paint on it. Just kind of thinning out this paint. I'll add even more white to my paint palette because this is what we're going to do next. With this value up here, I'm going to add even more white to it. So it's not straight white, but pretty close. And I'm going to fill in the top part. That's actually a little light. Might add a little bit more in there. There we go. Lighten up the top with not a perfect flat layer, especially because we don't want to get rid of that. See how I'm leaving tiny little remnants of gray? Almost looks like lines that's part of the fur. I'm not filling this in and making a perfectly polished, smooth layer. I'm using dabs carefully without covering up that subtle gray. Now this is where you have to almost sit with the mess. You have to sit with the imperfections, and that can be hard, especially if this is the first time or it's been a long time since you've painted. But this is exactly why art can be so healing and so helpful. If we make space for it, it can help us to let go and be okay with the flaws. Then into that value. So we have grays in there, we have white. I am going to add a range. I'm going to go in with our light value with purple, lighten that up. And this is what I'll use to begin to start making some of those markings. Now this probably will blend in with some of the light grays that we've already added. We want that. We want them to be subtle, ovals and circles, all different sizes. And I'll just scatter those all over the white fur. Not exactly where I see it in the reference, but kind of taking information from the reference and doing my own thing. And I want to encourage you to do the same. Okay, I'm going to darken it up by adding a little bit more of the light value. And now starting to add these markings that are just clusters of lines forming kind of an oval shape. And as I move down, I'm going to move to my medium value and blend it into that. My medium value, which has more blue in it, it's kind of what we started with down here, but it's light, it's not too dark. And notice I'm curving these oval shaped clusters of lines. See, that's a little too dark. I want to lighten it up a bit more. There's a strong one on the bridge of the nose right here. A little too dark, but let's see if I can maybe add a dark one here to kind of even it out, or even darken up this patch. There's one like right by the nose. I don't like how long and dark that is, so I'm going to get rid of it. I'm going to just shorten it. And even lighten it up. I just added some of that gray into it because it didn't dry yet. So next, with my size 1 round brush, I'm going to go back to my medium value. And where we left off with some of those dark medium value lines, I'm just going to bring them down a smidge. So I'm doing a couple things here. I'm not only creating the same texture that we're going to be adding soon around the lips with my medium value, but I'm also bringing down that blue with textured lines just so that we have enough blue, enough of a medium value base beneath the light strands. So I'm pulling them down a little further on that left lip. But then we only need a little bit of that. I'm going to go back with our liner brush with the light gray, and be careful, you only need a small amount of paint on your brush because these lines are very delicate, very, very short and slightly curving. On one lip, I'm going to work it up all the way to that line indent beneath the nose and join that with just a little bit more texture going in the opposite direction on the right top lip. And really making sure that not only do these lines join and connect at that line indent, but they come down pretty far over top the little cute little black lip that's beneath it. Now those strands were more vertical up and down, but here for the left on that muzzle, we're switching directions a little bit. I'm adding these lines up and in towards the nose. So these are going to be slightly angled and still a little curving, and I'm starting from the bottom and working up. Now, this is important because I won't bring the white all the way up beneath the nose. My lines will actually get a little darker, so I'm pulling in some of the medium value with our light gray in a separate pile because of how little light is getting under here. And these lines are also just a little bit shorter. Now, by now, you might have paint dried to your brush. You don't want that because then it's much harder to get those thin, short lines. And so if you need to, wash off your brush. Now those are just for the lines directly beneath the nose. But out here, I went back to my light gray because that's where it's getting a little bit of light. Now, if you recall, I mentioned that these markings are beneath this fine, thin white fur. So that's why I'm layering carefully over top those markings, but not getting rid of them. Now, just like we did on the left side beneath the nose on the muzzle, let's do that for the little bit we have left on the right side. So that's our medium value with a little bit of our gray. And I'm just gonna add lots more lines to really get this looking realistic. We need lots of fur texture. Now this next step is optional. I'm not even sure if it was really needed, but what I'm going to do next, if you want to, I'm going to add a little bit of the medium value in with our light gray. I don't want this too dark. I actually want this light And I'm going to add a little bit more darkness to some of these markings, cutting in around the fur texture that we've just applied. And I'm going to add another one at the bottom. I'm going to add a little bit of black to just a little bit of this gray, darken it up a little. Add some over top the lip, the bottom lip. Now more practice on clustering fur texture, but these are even thinner and even shorter. We want to get rid of that hard edge of that black lip on the top of it. And we also want to bring down, if you already haven't, bring down these strands from the top lips. We want to make sure it almost kind of looks like a little bit of a mustache. So I'm going to even pull those lines up higher around that line indent and over top the black lip. And just another reminder, be sure to wash off your brush, make sure it's clean and damp and not full of water. These long liner brushes can hold a lot of water. And that way we can add even more fine fur texture to the left of this muzzle. We want to bring it out, and I'm using the light gray. And you know where else we need to add some fine line texture? On the chin. Just a little bit of those fuzzy hairs at the very bottom overlapping our yellowish grays from the chest. All right, so now with the rigger brush, now we're going to add the strands that are cutting over top here and here. I'm going to add a little bit of the light violet in with this gray. Pause for a second, friend. Even by the look of my brush right now, there's too much paint on it, and it made lines that are just too thick. So I just want you to learn from my mistakes. Keep your brush thin with paint. Now, the lovely thing is that this is so easy to fix, and I'm going to show you that technique in a little bit. But what I'm doing right now with the light gray is ever so carefully adding the hairs that stick out in the direction of the eye, and then I change the direction of my brush on below that and to the left. So these are the same short lines just like we did on the muzzle. They are in on the white fur, but also layered over top the purple blue fur. Now, if you missed that, I just pulled in more of the light value indigo from when we were painting the fur. I'm working with vertical lines up along where we have the white marking and our purple blue fur. I'm getting rid of that harsh edge, that harsh line of where that white marking, the white strip along the bridge of the nose connects with the indigo fur by clustering lines over top those two areas. And I'll do that on both sides. But did you notice right here, my line direction changed. On the right side, it's going up and to the right, leaving gaps in between. On the left side, it's up and to the left. Now that line, that first line that I made, stands out a little too far out, and I'm just going to thin it out. So easy to just clean up around it. So did you see that? With our dark value indigo, I laid it over top part of that line to thin it out. And notice we went back to this once that line dried. And because I used a slightly different dark value there, that's why I'm bringing it up a little. And with that dark value, I'm revisiting it. I'll mix it with some of the medium value, the dark value and the medium value, so I can cut in around, bring it over a little bit more on the right side. I'll do that exact same thing on the opposite side, cutting in around the white lines. I just want to bring up that blue a little bit behind those strands. Something about that gap that I just want to break up with a little bit of that medium blue. Now that little brow above the left eye kind of stumps me a little bit, and so here I go back with that same mixture, the medium value with the dark value. I place a few clusters of lines that are very subtle to the left of that brow highlight. All right, now this next step, I'm going to ask you to omit. I actually end up putting this back later at the end of this tutorial. So skip this step. We don't want it very dark. But what does fit and well placed is the medium value indigo, just adding a bit more of a curve on the right side. Then it's a little tricky to get my brush just right because it is drying and it's a little sticky. I should have washed my brush off, but the correct value is a little bit of our light gray mixed with our medium blue, our medium indigo, and adding lines down a little further to the left of that muzzle. But I'm going to apply my cleanup technique on those strands. They got a bit thick. I'm using the dark value to cut in around them. Definitely where it connects with the white, that's where you want those lines coming out from. You want it coming out from the light gray. Now the mixture I'm pulling from is our light gray with a bit of our light value that we used when we painted the fur. I'll use that to add another marking on the at the top of the forehead. I'll even use that to lighten up the marking on the other side. So if you watch me, I'm going to add one here, and then because it's right next to a marking that's a little too dark and it's getting a lot of light, I'm going to paint it right over top there to lighten it up. Now, that's one way to kind of soften something and push it back. I'm also going to do that to get rid of this harsh line to the top left of the muzzle with this textured, very short, stubby lines that is right next to the fur texture we've already added, just to get rid of this harsh line and to soften it. And that's when I noticed a little bit of a gap on the left side of the muzzle at the bottom. I need to bring some lines down a little further, overlapping that chin area that we have that gray shadow. I'll also connect it to the light grays on this side again. And yet another round on the forehead on the left side of the white marking. See how I'm condensing even more white right where that line sits, connecting it to those curving lines? We want to blend it into that white fur texture on both sides. I'm just going to mix a little bit of the light value purple with some of the medium value blue. And lighten up this little highlight there in the eye. Even join them to the one in the bottom. I'm adding little dabs and lines over top the highlights we've already added and bringing this one to the far left of the eye down just a little bit. Add a little bit of that highlight, there we go, over. That's what's needed. To get rid of some of that part of the head, I'm going to go in with the dark value because I just think. Now I'm just going to ever so carefully bring down with the dark value, cutting in with lines on the far left side of the head. Then I'll add more white to this light value that we use for down here, get it even lighter, and create these curls over top some of the dark value grays. Add a little bit too much there. You don't want to get it too light just because of how little light is getting down there. So keeping the area above on the dark side, and not going too light with these curls and single lines. That's what I'm doing. Make clumps and single lines over top some of the medium values and a few over top the areas that are a bit darker. I'm going to add our medium value blue to a little bit more of this part of the face. So I want to bring more lightness into this area of the face. I'm going to add my medium values along the lines and also pull up some of the curls. Pull that ear up just a little bit. Now what I'm also going to do with the dark value is add some more of those scruffy, wispy hairs coming out. And you know where else we didn't do this is on the right side. No wonder it's a little off balance. But I'm going to need to add my medium value, so a mix of the medium and dark value, to add just a few of these off the right side of our canvas. And after doing that, I'm seeing that we could lift up this part of the forehead. And that's with our light gray, just ever so slightly on both sides, with still leaving that little dip on the very top of the head. And something that's really been sticking out to me is with my dark value, I'm just gonna add this darkness in the corner. There we go. And with that little bit of the dark value left on my brush, I'm gonna pull that side of the face out into the ear a little bit more. Subtle little things that we're adding here that add up to make a big difference. I'm gonna do a mix of our light purple and our medium value blue. A little bit more of the blue, and instead of that being a dark value, I think what needs to be here is a medium value. I'll trail those lines up and down right along that highlight, and once again add a few more rounds. Less is more here. We don't need to add too much. Like me, I added a little too much of those highlights, those lines to the right of that. I'm going to pull out some of the orange by picking up some of the orange with a bit of cadmium yellow and raw sienna. And ever so carefully, I'm just going to add a little hint more orange here on the nose. A few dabs in here too. Little dots around the far left side of the nose. And I have a little bit of, there we go, scratch that off. Now, in almost every painting I paint, at the end, I love to add accents of rainbow colors, all sorts of colors, little dabs here and there just to make it more interesting. I like to add these accents randomly, but especially over light areas or medium value areas. And I'm going to switch to my size 0 round brush. I'm going to mix up a mixture. At first, I just do it with cadmium yellow and yellow ochre, but I then add white, okay? I wipe this off, it's too dark. So that's yellow ochre, cad yellow, and white, and I add these subtle, random little dots, dabs, throughout the portrait. See how random but small these little dabs are over top the areas where we've gone with a medium value indigo or a light value gray, just little dots. And see how I'm pulling a little bit of it off with my finger? I'm softening it. And if you don't like it, any dab or dot, you can just paint right over it. And then with that, I'll mix up some more light yellow. So that's cadmium yellow with yellow ochre and some white. Sorry that this is a little hard to see, but that's yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, and white. And with my palette knife, I'm going to add some sporadic texture to the background. Now loosen up here. I know we've been a little tight getting all those details in, but allow yourself to be free. Add that sporadic color in the background to pull out those purples even more. And you can see I'm pushing down with that paint on the back of my palette knife. You can see I'm trying to be careful not to go over the dog, but working around it and not entirely covering up our peach background. Now, if you don't have a palette knife, you can also use a brush. I recommend like a large flat brush, like your size 10 flat brush, or even an angle brush. You do want to load up your paint, add that thick texture. Here I just pulled in a little bit more white, and just to a few of these, I'm adding little bright highlights of white. Just a little touch up on here because I went over a little bit. And then the last and final step is whiskers. For that, you'll need your size 0 liner brush, but I recommend mixing up a light gray. So you can use any of the leftover light grays. Mine's kind of dry, so I'm just gonna mix up. I'll take a little bit of this gray from down here and with some white. Waste not. Now this is actually not the final step. We have a few more to go, but generally I like to leave the whiskers till the very end. And I recommend you watch me here first before giving it a try. With just a small amount of our light gray on our brush, I'm gonna start out over top the ear and then draw that with a slightly curving line towards the muzzle. Then I'm gonna take it about halfway and pull it back towards the muzzle, but as I do that, I'm pushing down on my brush. The reason I had to do that is because my brush kind of runs out of paint, and so I have to go back over it and thicken that line up slightly, because the thinnest point is the tip of the whisker. The thickest point is where it connects to the muzzle. Thankfully for us, this is a white furry muzzle. We don't have to do anything really there. Now this is a little tricky being right-handed. This might be easier for you left-handed artists, but I also want to make sure that these whiskers are overlapping. We're getting them longer here because we're so up close to the dog, but normally dogs don't have very long whiskers. We can't really see them. And also sometimes dogs have black whiskers. Now you can see I'm going to go back to the end of this whisker, come out even more so that that very end of this whisker is the thinnest point. That's kind of a way you can fix up a whisker if it's just too thick. Now I'm painting the longer whiskers here, but the ones that are the lower muzzle and around the lips are curving more and they're much shorter. So as I move down, I'm going to make these whiskers do that very thing, short and with a strong curl. Challenges like this grow us. This is a skill I've had to practice over and over and over again, and still I mess up. But like we learned, we can always go back to the background color or the dark blue or even medium blue and cut in around it to thin out our lines if they're too thick. We are almost there, creatives. Just a few more steps left and we are finished. Make sure that to prevent overworking your portrait, you step back often. Now I'm going to add just a few more lines of our light gray to the top of the head. To draw out more of that purple, even more, I'm going to add more accents and depths with our yellow mixture, where we added cadmium yellow, white, and yellow ochre. Once more with our light value indigo, I'm going to add a few stubby short lines, almost touching that top whisker here. And I'm adding back in, so you might not need this, but I'm adding back in this lightness with clusters of lines to the left of that white marking on the head with our light value indigo. All right, creative, so I'm finally gonna remedy that brow that's been bothering me throughout this tutorial. I'm gonna show you some new techniques too. So with our filbert brush size 2, I'm gonna do a glaze where I add lots of water to our medium value indigo. I'm also gonna add in more of the dark value, and I'm gonna push that highlight back at the bottom. Not get rid of it, but making it less bold, that highlight less bold by adding this very thin glaze over top. I'm going to pull in some of our dark value, and I'll actually be even adding more phalocyanin blue, violet, and a bit of gray to it to not only darken up that area to the right of where we were just working, but to also slightly separate some of those medium value hairs from the top of the head here. Subtle lines we're adding here, very subtle, like just a little bit more feathering to the right of that. And I'm going to pull off some of this paint, so it's now the dry brush technique. So just a little bit of paint over top this area, again, not covering it up, but having this gradual change from dark to medium to light. So I'm almost creating a medium value here. Now I still have more of that left on my brush, and that little amount I'm going to add on the right side. Now I add that with what just little bit I have on my filbert brush. I add that directly above the eye in the middle. I'll even work that up again just to soften that bold highlight even more. And a few dabs below the eye in the lower left. And once more connecting that area of the left side of the forehead with that dark fur. Now with a small amount of that light value indigo on my brush, I'm going to give more of a curve at the top of the head on both sides. And then the final steps is adding this very value in 2 more spots on the face. I'm going to lengthen and draw out this line to the upper left above the eye. And bring down that highlight below the eye, directly below the eye, just a little bit more. If it's a little too light, like I pushed down a little too hard on my brush, you can either wipe it off. If that doesn't do it, pull in more of the medium value. And there you have it. I hope you thoroughly enjoyed this tutorial, learned a lot about yourself too in this creative expression. Thank you so much for watching. If you already haven't, be sure to like and subscribe and share. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.